All right, so we're diving into Juz 27 of the Quran. Big stuff, huh? We're talking about God, creation, what it all means for us, the kind of questions people have been asking forever. And while we can't cover the entire Quran in this deep dive, these verses give us a really fascinating look into some core Islamic ideas. What do you think? Ready to jump in?
Absolutely, let's do it.
One thing that really jumped out at me, especially in Surah Ar-Rahman, was this phrase, so which of the favors of your Lord would you deny? It's like repeated, almost like a challenge.
It is powerful, isn't it? It's not just about being thankful. It really makes you think about how many blessings there are, the things we don't even realize.
And it's not just general, like be thankful. It gets so specific. The sun and the moon, the stars, all working together, all the different kinds of food we have. Dates, grains, even plants with incredible smells. There's even one about pearls and coral coming from the sea.
Yeah, it reminds me of how throughout history, people have always looked to nature to understand the divine. These verses really capture that sense of awe.
Totally. But then, right alongside this appreciation for creation, we get some pretty direct warnings, especially about civilizations that didn't make it. It's not all, sunshine and rainbows.
Right. The Quran doesn't shy away from what happened to those who rejected the message. Noah's flood, the people of Ad and Thamud. They're reminders that our choices have consequences.
And this pattern repeats. God sends messengers, people deny them, and then, well, there are consequences. Makes you think about how important it is to recognize the truth, to listen to warnings. It reminds me of that story, Icarus flying too close to the sun, not listening, and facing the consequences.
It's a universal idea for sure. Those stories come from Islamic tradition, but that message is something we see across cultures. Flood myths, stories about pride and ignoring wisdom. It's everywhere.
Makes you think about the choices we make, big and small, and how they could play out. Not just in this life, but maybe the next. Which, speaking of the purpose of life, one verse really stood out. I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me. Seems pretty direct about why we're here.
It's definitely a core belief in Islam, that worshiping God is our main reason for being. But it's important to understand, worship in Islam isn't just about rituals and prayer. It's much bigger than that.
So it's not just bowing your head 5 times a day.
Right. It's about living your whole life according to God's will. Compassion, justice, kindness in everything you do. It's like this guide for how you treat others, how you treat yourself, how you approach everything. It's about seeing God in every part of life.
Which leads perfectly into another big theme in these verses, judgment. What happens after we die. And the descriptions are, wow, intense. We get these vivid pictures of both paradise and hellfire.
It's vivid language for sure. Paradise with beautiful gardens, rivers flowing, being with companions who are pure.
Okay, hold on. Gotta pause there for a second. That whole companions thing, especially how it's sometimes explained, it might be a little eyebrow-raising for listeners who aren't familiar with Islamic beliefs about the afterlife. We should probably unpack that a bit.
Absolutely. Context is key, and we will definitely come back to that. But for now, it's about the contrast. Because alongside those images of paradise, we also get descriptions of hellfire. Scorching heat, burning water, the suffocating black smoke. It's meant to make you really think.
It's definitely not subtle. Like this cosmic reality check, what we do matters. Choices have consequences, and not just some philosophical idea.
And it goes back to the idea of the book. Mentioned a few times, every single thing we do is recorded. That's powerful, right? It's about reflecting on what we do, being accountable.
So you've got this huge E backdrop, creation, destruction, these beings like jinn existing alongside us, but then it gets really personal too. Feels very real and relevant, even though it was revealed so long ago.
Exactly. Speaks to the grand scheme of things. Andy, our personal struggles, what motivates us. It acknowledges that we get caught up in everyday life, but reminds us there's a bigger picture.
Which I think brings up something important, especially for people who aren't familiar with how to approach scripture. These verses were revealed over 1,400 years ago in a very specific culture. So how do we even begin to understand something like that today?
That is a big question. It's something scholars are always working on, right? How do you take something as timeless as spiritual truth and apply it to life today?
And especially when you have verses that seem to clash with modern values, how do you deal with that? Like, for example, the verses about fair women as a reward in paradise. That's definitely going to raise some eyebrows today with our focus on equality and respect between genders. What are your thoughts on that?
It's complicated, and there are lots of different opinions, even within Islamic scholarship, about the best way to interpret those passages. Some scholars say it's really important to remember the historical and cultural norms of that time. They might say, okay, the language reflects 7th century Arabia, But the deeper meaning is about spiritual fulfillment and happiness, which goes beyond any literal interpretation.
So not necessarily taking it literally.
Right. It's about finding the deeper meaning, recognizing that the descriptions of paradise represent something beyond what we can imagine here on Earth. It's about focusing on what it's really saying, not getting caught up in the literal image.
That makes sense. It's a good reminder that with ANY sacred text, you have to come to it with humility, with an openness to discuss and interpret. There's wisdom in those traditional understandings, A&D, and how we understand them in today's world.
I totally agree. It's through that ongoing discussion that we can deepen our understanding of these really profound and complex verses. Not shying away from the tough questions, but really engaging with them thoughtfully and respectfully.
It's a journey, right?
It is. And like any good journey, it's got twists and turns, unexpected discoveries, and moments of real awe. It really is a journey. And, thinking about journeys, one thing that really struck me in these verses is how they bring together the physical world and the spiritual world. You've got mountains falling apart, stars falling from the sky, all this talk about jinn, but it still feels grounded in the human experience, you know what I mean?
Totally. It's like, it's saying, hey, there's this whole other layer to existence beyond what you can see and touch. This life, all the good and bad, it's just one part of a much bigger story.
Exactly. And that actually brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, those companions in paradise, and how that fits with what we believe today. It's really important to remember that throughout history, the way we understand religious texts, it changes and evolves. Something that people understood one way 1,000 years ago might make sense in a totally different way now.
So how do we make sense of those verses, the ones about fair women being a reward? When we think about equality and respect between genders, it feels, well, a little off, to say the least, hearing it today.
It's definitely a touchy subject and a complicated one. When we look at those verses, we have to be really careful and understand there isn't just one way to interpret them. Everyone agrees on that. Some scholars say those descriptions, they're not meant to be taken literally, that they reflect the culture and language of that time, but point to a deeper truth.
So maybe not meant to be taken at face value.
Right. Instead of focusing on physical appearance, it's really about the spiritual happiness and fulfillment that paradise represents, something that goes beyond our earthly wants and limits. It's about understanding that the Quran uses imagery that would have made sense to people back then in that time and place.
So it's like how we use metaphors today, right? To get across something we can't quite put into words directly.
Exactly. And when we look at it like that, through that lens of metaphor and historical context, that's how we can bridge the gap between what the text meant originally and how we see it now. It takes a balance of respecting tradition, a being open to what those words mean in today's world.
It's like you need both your head and your heart, faith, and reason to really get it.
Absolutely. And speaking of balance, something else that stands out is how much these verses emphasize God's mercy along with his power. It's not all about punishment and fear, right? There's this constant message of forgiveness, of compassion that has no limits.
Yeah, you see it right from the start of Surah Ar-Rahman, the most merciful. It's like the foundation of the whole chapter.
Exactly. Even when it gets pretty intense with the descriptions of hellfire, there's this unwavering thread of hope. It reminds us that God's mercy is always there, always available, if you truly seek it.
It's like even when things go wrong, even when we screw up, there's that chance to make things right, to ask for forgiveness and try to be better.
It's a human experience, isn't it? Messing up and hoping for a second chance. And these verses offer that reassurance. It's never too late to turn back to God, to follow his guidance, and try to live a life that's, in line with what we believe.
And it's interesting, right alongside these verses about creation and destruction, judgment, there's also this focus on the power of God's words themselves. Like when it describes the destruction of El-Ad, it says the wind left nothing of what it came upon, but that it made it like disintegrated ruins. It's intense.
The language in the Quran, it's incredibly powerful and poetic, right? It's meant to make you feel awe and wonder, to remind you of how mighty the Creator is.
And it's not just about destruction either. There are equally powerful descriptions of creation, like when it talks about God spreading out the earth and making it beautiful. You really get a sense of his artistry and intention.
Totally. The Quran uses nature to show us God's attributes, the beauty, the balance, how intricately everything is designed. It's like every part of creation, from the tiniest seed to the vastness of space, points back to the divine.
It's like it's saying, look around, open your eyes. Can you really deny that something amazing is happening here?
Right. It invites us to change our perspective, to see the world through a lens of faith, and recognize that God is present in everything around us. It changes how we experience the world.
I love that. It becomes more than words on a page. Those words actually change how you see things, how you feel, how you interact with everything around you.
Exactly. And that shift in how we see things, it can lead to a deeper appreciation for everything, more humility, more responsibility. We start to see ourselves as caretakers of this amazing gift, and it's up to us to use it wisely and be grateful for it.
Makes you think about how we treat the planet, how we treat each other, how we treat ourselves, right? It's all connected.
It is. And that idea of being connected, that's something you see again and again in these verses, don't you think?
For sure. It's like a reminder that we're all part of something much bigger than ourselves, woven together.
And in that big picture, we all have a role to play, a purpose. Speaking of purpose, there's this other verse I found really interesting. It says, "Indeed, those who do not believe in the hereafter name the angels female names, and they have thereof no knowledge." It seems to be saying how important it is to look for knowledge, to not just make up our minds based on assumptions or what we hear from others.
It reminds me of that saying, a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous. Like it's warning us against judging things we don't really understand.
Exactly. It's about approaching knowledge with humility, realizing there's always more to learn. Sometimes the smartest thing we can do is admit what we don't know.
Be open to different viewpoints, interpretations,
Mm.
new ways of seeing the world and our place in it. It's about embracing the mystery of it all.
And that mystery, that sense of wonder,
Right.
that's what's at the heart of faith, right? Being willing to believe in something beyond what we can see or prove.
Trusting in something bigger than us, even when we don't have all the answers. That leap of faith.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, that willingness to step into the unknown, trusting in your faith and wanting to learn. And in a way, that's what we're doing here with this deep dive, exploring, questioning, finding new meaning in these ancient verses.
It's a journey. And something tells me we're only just getting started.
Oh, for sure. There's always something more to discover, something more to think about. And that's what makes engaging with these texts so incredible. They keep giving us new insights as time goes on.
It really is a journey, isn't it? And we started off talking about the really big picture stuff, creation, destruction, these huge ideas. But then these verses, they get really personal too, don't they? Talking about what we struggle with inside, what we chase after, all those very human things.
Absolutely. It's like the Quran speaks to the whole universe and to each of us individually. It gets that we all want success, security, to feel important. But it also reminds us that real happiness, it usually comes from something beyond all that.
There's that one verse that really hit me about people chasing wealth and status. It compares it to a rain whose plant growth pleases the tillers, then it dries and you see it turned yellow, then it becomes debris. It's like,
Yeah.
it really makes you think about how temporary those things really are.
It's a powerful image, right? We work so hard building our lives, collecting things. But at the end of the day, it's all temporary. Those things might make you feel good for a little bit, but the Quran says real, lasting fulfillment. It comes from something deeper, something that lasts.
Makes you think twice about what you're prioritizing in your own life, Especially these days when everyone's telling you to work harder, get more, buy more. It's like a reminder to just stop and ask yourself, what actually matters in the grand scheme of things?
And it's not about saying you can't have those things. Ambition, success, enjoying what you've worked for. It's about putting them in their place, keeping things in perspective, finding that balance between what we're doing in the world and our own spiritual growth.
Balance. Yeah, that keeps coming up in these verses. And speaking of balance, something I find really comforting is how much it emphasizes God's mercy. It's not just about punishment, right? There's this constant reassurance that there's forgiveness, second chances.
It's a core part of how Muslims understand God.
Yeah.
Don't forget, the very first verse of Surah Rahman is the most merciful. It sets the tone for the whole chapter, that even when it talks about judgment and responsibility, God's mercy, it covers everything.
It's like that idea of tough love, right? There are consequences, but it's coming from a place of love. It's about helping us be our best selves, not just in this life, but in the next one too.
That's a great way to put it. And it gets to the heart of what these verses are trying to tell us. We have so much potential, and we should strive to be good, to be righteous, and no matter what, God's mercy is always there for us.
It's been quite a journey going through these verses with you. We've covered so much: creation, destruction, judgment, what our purpose is, the nature of faith, even how we make sense of these ancient texts in today's world. What a deep dive.
It really has been. And it shows how rich and complex the Quran is. There are so many layers of meaning to uncover, so much wisdom that still feels relevant today, even though it was revealed so long ago.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I hope our listeners take away from this. No matter what their background is, what they believe, whether you really connected with these verses or they challenged your way of thinking, or even if it just made you want to learn more, I hope this deep dive has encouraged you to keep asking those big questions, keep searching, keep exploring.
Because ultimately, that's what it's all about, right? Trying to understand, thinking about our place in the universe,
Mhm.
trying to live a life that matches up with what we value, what we aspire to.
And on that note, I'm going to leave you with something to think about. It's inspired by all those thought-provoking questions in the Quran. If you look at everything, the seeds you plant, the metal we use, the tiniest grain of sand, even the vastness of space, if all of that is a sign from God, how does that change how you see the world? How does it change the way you live your life?